What's up guys, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nate and I'm a main tank for Pieces. Today I'm going to be giving you an insight into my thoughts and impressions on the tanks for the up and coming raid tier in 9.2, and I'll be outlining the reasonings behind why I think some of the tanks are going to perform better than others, as well as briefly touching on the tier sets and double legendaries, but as a general rule of thumb, unless you're performing at the very top level, any tank will be good enough to play. I always think it's really important to think outside the box and make educated choices instead of just following a meta someone has informed you about, so always take everything I say with a pinch of salt, as well as everything mentioned here is subject to change with tuning. I'll always play what is needed to assist my raid team to progress, and with that mindset there is a good quote I believe I heard from Sloot being "one team, one dream." If you're interested in watching me play any of these tanks, you can always catch me whenever I'm live over at twitch.tv/cutie_Nate. I'll start with one of the tanks I think might struggle the most, being Protection Warrior. Warrior is always an insane tank when it comes to any blockable damage, and if it's blockable I'm almost certain you require the least external healing, but the issue arises when the damage profile of the bosses isn't blockable. Now, I don't think Warrior is necessarily bad for the raid, and I want to reiterate that all tanks are good enough to play in their current state, but I do think you'll struggle on some of the fights in the new raid even with some of the amazing utility you bring in terms of things like Rally, Battle Shout, Intervene, the list goes on. However, Protection Warrior does lose some of its value whenever the DPS specs of the class are worth playing, just because you lose that niche of the Battle Shout. Moving on to the tier sets we've been given, the Protection Warrior 2-piece is actually really nice, being a stack management buff that increases your damage by a good chunk if you're utilising it properly, and the 4-piece being a nice flat 10% extra damage increase and 10% damage reduction during Avatar, essentially forcing you into playing anger management now for as much uptime as possible. Not that you didn't mostly opt for it before, but you had options before, and now not doing so means the downsides of not running it are even more drastic. We also have double legendaries now at our disposal, and that being said I believe that all covenants except Venthyr are pretty good for us. Kyrian and Nightfay both compete for raw damage output, whereas Necrolord currently allows you to have 100% uptime on Conqueror's banner given you have no downtime, which can be pretty nasty if utilised effectively. Your best legendaries outside of the specific covenant ones remain the same, being the Wall and Reprisal, which get even more value now due to the extra rage generation combined with anger management and the tier set synergies. Just to summarise, I think if the encounter allows Warrior to shine, it has the potential to be one of the best tanks, but the conditions for it need to be met. Next up we'll talk about Vengeance Demon Hunter. Vengeance DH is pretty good at dealing with spiky damage profiles as opposed to consistent, as their mitigation uptime is somewhat lacking. They require downtime from tanking in order to recover cooldowns, or they suffer a fair amount. This is redeemed somewhat through legendaries like Fiery Soul, but generally speaking they aren't as strong as other options, and unless they can break the encounter, for example SLG pre-nerf in some way, or are broken, or Havoc is too bad to be played, you generally don't see this spec. The magic damage reduction from your tattoos is pretty nice, on top of the hypermobility and 5% debuff you can apply. But Vengeance Demon Hunter suffers from the same hindrance as Warrior in regards to its niche when you consider its DPS counterpart, that also brings the raid buff, as well as a strong raid cooldown in terms of darkness. As for the tier sets, the 2-piece has a fairly low proc rate single target, as it procs off Immolation Aura ticks, lessening its value outside of multi-target scenarios. The 4-piece however was recently changed, allowing us to get more uses of Immolation Aura and Fel Devastation throughout an encounter, and this paired with the demonic talent can give us a bit more meta uptime, but it won't be that impactful for the overall strength of the spec in a raid setting. Double legendaries for Vengeance are pretty decent, with Kyrian and Venthyr rising up due to synergies with the tier set. Venthyr gains benefits from the lower Fel Devastation cooldown, although on single target you'll only be able to get a singular extension per brand unless you for some reason run the Fel Devastation Lego and get lucky, which I don't think beats out the value you gain from other legendaries such as Fiery Soul, at least within a progress environment. And Kyrian can allow for some minor passive mitigation and damage gain every 45 to 60 seconds when you sigil, which only gets stronger the more targets there are. All in all, Vengeance lacks single target damage and has no real raid utility. Paired with the previously mentioned, it just leads me to think they're in a rough spot right now in comparison to all the other tanks. Now, Brewmaster is a personal favourite of mine, and I think they're in a solid position for 9.2. They have the potential to do some of the highest damage out of all those tanks, especially on high physical damage encounters where you're purifying a lot just due to how your Ox works and the new 4-piece tier set being very strong in its current iteration. With how strong Brewmaster the EHP is and damage smoothing, it's only going to get better in the new tier due to the 2-piece allowing for more flat passive damage reduction, as well as the max HP gains from the 4-piece. However, Celestial Brew wasn't increased, which I assume is some form of compensation, and is a fairly noticeable hit. Outside of that, you bring hypermobility in the form of double roll and transcendence, which can have very niche but powerful applications, and along with the other two monk specs you bring the 5% physical debuff, but as seen already there's a common trend where one of the other specs of your class that can apply your raid buff is good, and therefore it diminishes the value and that niche that you bring along with having no raid cooldown. The introduction of double legendaries are pretty interesting for Brewmaster, allowing for some Covenant options being viable that weren't particularly viable before, and it's a significant buff to the Covenant options that already were. There's not a lot to say on this, as I don't think it will shift what was meta before in regards to Covenants for Brew in a raid setting, but it certainly adds a candidate to the list being Night Fae. How strong it is yet to be determined, as the single target damage is still somewhat lackluster, but we'll see, and it's not that bad by any means. Next up is Guardian Druid. I've always mostly disliked this spec in raid, solely due to personal enjoyment, but I have to admit I believe it's one of the better options going into 9.2 for raiding. Damage was always generally an issue during progress, as you never really had much opportunity to owl or cat weave, but with the introductions of the new tier set, the damage even disregarding shape shifting is pretty good. As always, you're a brick wall on bear. The class has so many defensives to rotate between, as well as the Barkskin legendary being extremely powerful in what it does. You don't bring a specific raid buff like the previously mentioned tanks, and your utility you offer definitely depends on the encounter as to how valuable it can be, as well as player ability and talent / Covenant options, so I'd say the skill floor is fairly low, but the ceiling is somewhat high when it comes to squeezing the most possible out of this spec. The 2-piece tier set is nice, as more berserk uptime is always valuable, especially when factoring in the synergy with its counterpart 4-piece, which is fantastic. It adds a significant amount of damage, particularly on multi-target scenarios, but I do expect to see slight tuning on this, and I'd be surprised if it went live in its current iteration, similarly to the Brewmaster 4-piece. When it comes to double legendaries, I think Kyrian will be pretty powerful in a raid environment, with your simp buff being fairly potent if you're min-maxing it properly. The only downside of this is you cut your own damage by a decent chunk. I do expect tuning on this legendary, but we'll see. Night Fae will always be a solid option, even more so with now 1 minute Convoke, and I've heard some interesting things about Necrolord, but I don't have enough data on it to make an educated assumption on how it will perform. The only thing I will touch on is I believe Necrolord have the best soul binds for pure tankiness. I get a lot of questions in regards to playing Benfear on Guardian, but I don't see you ever really playing it in a raid setting, because as a tank you never really want to put all your eggs into the 3-minute basket, and even if you do, the damage for it is pretty mediocre at best. All in all, Guardian is looking very good for the new raid. The large boss rooms mean the 1 minute roar comes in handy, the damage is good, and depending on the player you can assist your raid a decent amount in other regards. Then we have Death Knight. Death Knight is up there as one of my favourites alongside Brewmaster, as you have the most agency over your own survivability, and I believe they are looking very very good for the next tier. You're extremely tanky if played well, however the damage is nothing special. A lot of the damage profiles of the bosses are quite favourable for DK, and the raid cooldown you bring in AMZ can be pretty strong and scale well with new gear. You have some of the best and most unique utility out of all the tanks, being Death Grip and Mass Grip, giving you major control over any ad-centric fights, which can be even more potent with the application of Abomination Limb, giving you even more grips on a 2-minute cooldown, but again, it's just fairly low on the damage spectrum, and its mobility leaves something to be desired as always. I both like and dislike the DK tier sets, just because they seem somewhat boring, however they are pretty powerful. The 2-piece bonus is stronger in Mythic Plus than it is in Raid, but it's still decent, allowing you to get roughly double the Dancing Rune weapon uptime you would have had previously on single target, and the stacking strength buff feels good. The 4-piece is a bit more interesting in that we are gaining a second Dancing Rune weapon. This has a lot of lovely interactions with the extra copy of your abilities, being that we get 9 Bone Shield stacks up from the 6 previously from Marrow End, a third Plague Dot application as well as an extra 33% damage on our other abilities just from the extra copy. The parry chance does not increase from the first rune weapon to the second, however. All things considered, it's still a noticeable strength gain in raid, and any increase in power to DK is welcomed in my book. Double legendaries give quite a bit of nice smooth synergy in regards to how we want to play and the new tier sets, and I'm willing to say 3 of the 4 Covenant choices are very good in the new raid, with Venfear being the outlier in that its Covenant legendary is just too undertuned with its current iteration. I won't hop into why each Covenant is good in their specific interactions, as we'll be here for a while, but I do have a detailed write-up over in my Discord that you can find the link to join in the description. This doesn't just include DK but all the tanks. Returning to where I was, outside of the Covenant legendaries we have some amazing options that synergize well with the new tier set bonuses as well as some of the Covenant Legos, these being most notably Crimson Rune Weapon and Gorfien's Domination. I get a lot of questions in regards to Super Strain, and I need to do more testing with it, but I do not believe it's worth to run it once you've obtained even just the 2-piece tier set. And last but not least, Protection Paladin. Paladin has been pretty dominant in Sanctum of Domination, but with nerfs to Ashen as well as other Covenant options being more viable now, we have a lot more wiggle room to play with. Pala offers so much in regards to damage and utility, but if you're not utilising the spec to its fullest, which already has the highest skill floor out of all the tanks, then I don't believe there's any real point to touch this spec in a raid setting. You don't bring any particular raid buff per se, but you have an immunity, you have bop, spell warding, sack, freedom, insane off healing. The applications of what this class can do are seemingly endless and are so valuable in a progress setting. However, the class can have issues in regards to its own personal survivability, so it's hard to make a good assessment on whether it will be worth to bring, especially considering we don't really know much about the last 3 bosses, and those are what matter the most at the end of the day. As for tier sets, it's pretty funny because actually during me writing this, Prop Pala 4-piece received a change, which is most definitely a buff. The 2-piece set bonus is just a passive block chance increase whenever you shielded a righteous, which works out to be roughly 4 to 5% damage reduction, which is fairly nice and somewhat similar to the Brewmaster 2-piece, just with its 100% uptime as long as you are maintaining shielded a righteous. The 4-piece is pretty amazing now, especially considering the previous iteration almost saw no effect in raid, but with the changes now it is very noticeable. More testing is required however, since it only just got changed and we don't know the internal cooldown yet, but it's very easy to tell it's very strong. As for double legendaries, previously you only really played Venfear, and now I believe you have the option of all 4 covenants if you really wanted to. Kyrian Divine Toll gives a good defense bonus on top of that AoE interrupt having some applications in the raid. Venfear's Ashen is still Ashen, even despite the nerfs, and Necrolord seems to be decent single target damage, and with the Soulbinds and Fleshcraft to help out in the tankiness department too, it's not that bad. Then we also have Nightfade to consider, which is just a simp bot, but it can be pretty potent if it's min-maxed, but not really worth otherwise. Outside of the Covenant legendaries, you have quite a few options on Pala, most notably Magistrate's Judgment, Mad Paragon, and the King's Proc, all being strong in different scenarios and being potent in their own ways. That almost concludes my thoughts and feelings on each of the tanks for the up and coming raid in 9.2, and I'll just reiterate like I did before, where I believe all tanks are worth playing unless you're at the very top level. And with that, I'll give you a brief summary on it all. I think Warrior and DH are the least likely to be played, followed by Brewmaster, then Guardian, then DK, then Pala. That being said, they all have niches that they fit into and can perform very well for, so even though I've stated Warrior for example might not see play, hypothetically speaking, there may be a boss or two that is specifically a beast for, and you might see some of the world first guilds bring it out. Lastly, I want to speak on the fact that some class concepts and tanking just come naturally to some over others, so what might be good to play for one person may vary comparing it to another. We're all humans, we all make mistakes, and your experience may be wildly different to that of mine. However, what I've mentioned in this video speaks solely for the objective mechanics of each of the classes and my impressions on them. If you've made it this far into the video, I hope you enjoyed, and good luck for the launch of patch 9.2. I'm hoping to expand my content outside of Twitch, and I'm considering making some guides in the new tier for each of the tanks for both Mythic Plus and raiding, so if that's something you're interested in, feel free to subscribe. Making this was way out of my comfort zone, and if you have any constructive feedback, feel free to comment below and help me out. I appreciate you all, and I'll see you next time or over on my Twitch at twitch.tv/cutie_Nate. Thank you all for watching, and much love.